A single knock shattered the safe house's silence at 3:17 a.m. in East Berlin. 6 agents dead, 3 nuclear codes sold in the 1968 collapse of a West German covert operation. But the traitor was Captain James Whitaker, a Medal of Honor recipient who swore to die before betraying his country. His betrayal began during a routine 1968 transfer of a classified dossier on Soviet missile placements between CIA Station Berlin and the Pentagon. The dossier contained a coded message hidden in its margin, a cipher leading to a KGB recruiter in a dimly lit cafe near the Brandenburg Gate. Whitaker, then a liaison officer, was tasked with securing the dossier, but secretly passed its contents to the KGB. The coded message used a polyalphabetic cipher requiring a specific key known only to the KGB and Whitaker. By 1972, the same cipher had been used to leak details of Operation Midnight Sun, a U.S. surveillance program in Siberia. Whitaker's dual role as a hero and traitor remained undetected until a 1983 audit revealed inconsistencies in Cold War intelligence files. His story became a classified case file, numbered 007-1983, filed under Betrayal's The Soldier in Every American War. The dead drop's contents included microfilm rolls, encrypted data on U.S. surveillance networks, and the names of 23 American operatives. Whitaker's recruitment was methodical. The KGB used a dead drop in the Berlin Wall's shadow, a hollowed-out cigarette pack left in a park bench containing a single phrase, "The lion sleeps, but the hunter watches." For years, he walked the tightrope. Briefings in Washington, coded letters passed to a contact in Prague, and a safe house in Vienna where he met his handler, a former Red Army officer named Viktor Petrov. His wife, Margaret, never knew the truth. She believed he was on a temporary assignment in Europe. Their daughter, Emily, would later find his journal, pages filled with guilt, paranoia, and the haunting question, how do you betray the people who trust you? The KGB's plan was simple: weaponize Whitaker's access to U.S. military intelligence. His first act of treason? Supplying the Soviets with the location of a U.S. listening post in West Berlin. But there was one detail that didn't make sense, and no one noticed it yet. The dead drop's contents included a photograph of Whitaker's daughter, Emily, taken 3 months before her birth. A clue buried in plain sight. What happened next would take years to fully understand. In 1972, Whitaker was arrested during a routine customs check at JFK Airport, his passport bearing a forged Soviet visa. The KGB had planned for this. His handler Petrov had already fled to Moscow, leaving behind a final message: the lion wakes, but the hunter is gone. But what investigators discovered next changed everything. Whitaker's confession was damning, but it omitted one name, a fellow officer who had warned him about the dead drop's compromise. And then, the one piece of evidence no one expected surfaced, a microfilm hidden in Whitaker's tooth containing the names of his collaborators. The most devastating revelation was still to come. In the shadow world, the deepest betrayal comes from the person you trust the most. Subscribe and hit the bell for more classified stories that were never meant to see daylight. Tell us in the comments. Could you spot a double agent in your own life? The knock came at 3:07 a.m. on November 12, 1985. A single, deliberate rap against the steel door of a safe house in Vienna. Inside, the KGB's first directorate had waited years for this moment. The dead drop, hidden in a hollowed-out copy of Red Star magazine, contained microfilm detailing the U.S. Army's new encrypted radio systems. The betrayal had been years in the making, but the evidence was now in their hands. Over 200 U.S. operatives were compromised. Intelligence on Operation Mongoose, a covert plan to destabilize Cuba, had been sold to the Soviets. The KGB's counterintelligence unit, the GRU, had traced the leak to a single source, Captain William Wexler, a decorated Army officer with a 22-year career and a record so clean it had been cited in Pentagon training manuals. Wexler had arrived at Fort Bragg in 1963, fresh out of West Point. A graduate of the class of 1962, he'd served in the 82nd Airborne during the Vietnam War, earning a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart for leading a rescue mission under fire near Saigon in 1967. His superiors called him the model soldier, a man who carried his rifle with precision, his orders with discipline, and his loyalty with unshakable conviction. By 1970, he'd been promoted to captain and stationed at the U.S. Army Intelligence Center in Germany. His reputation as a trusted officer grew. Colleagues described him as a man who never missed a briefing, never questioned an order, and never looked twice at a classified document. He married Margaret Wexler, a schoolteacher from North Carolina, in 1972. They had 2 children, a son, Daniel, and a daughter, Emily. Their home in Stuttgart was a picture of normalcy until the KGB's recruitment began. Wexler's trust was not just professional. His commanding officer, Colonel Harold Langston, once wrote in a personnel review, "Captain Wexler is the kind of man who would die before betraying his country. He is the soldier in every war, unquestioning, unshakable, and uncorrupted." The words would later haunt Langston, who would be among those forced to confront the betrayal. But behind the medals and the medals, Wexler had begun to fracture. His wife noticed a change, longer absences, sudden silences when he returned home, a growing detachment from their children. He'd started attending lectures at the University of Heidelberg, where he met a professor with ties to the East German Stasi. The professor, Dr. Bielmar Klaus Richter, had been a KGB asset since 1968. Wexler's curiosity about Soviet tactics, his frustration with U.S. military bureaucracy, and his growing disillusionment with the Vietnam War had made him an easy target. The first coded message was slipped into his pocket during a routine inspection in 1973. It read, "The wolf does not bark at the hunter." Wexler didn't understand it at first, but he kept it, and he kept returning to Richter's lectures. The KGB had found their man. By 1975, Wexler was meeting with KGB agents in a basement safe house beneath a bakery in Munich. Dead drops were made in hollowed-out books and cigarette cases. His double life was a tightrope walk, reporting to his superiors by day, passing secrets to the Soviets by night. The psychological toll would come later. For now, the betrayal was just beginning. The knock came at 3:17 a.m. on April 5, 1968, in a Berlin safe house near Checkpoint Charlie. A rusted briefcase lay on the floor, its contents exposed, microfilm reels, a cipher key, and a single page of handwriting. The handwriting belonged to Colonel Harold Wexler, a U.S. Army intelligence officer with a 20-year record of valor. The briefcase had been left at a dead drop near the Brandenburg Gate, a location Wexler himself had once marked as high risk for surveillance. By 1968, Wexler had become a fixture in Pentagon briefings, his name synonymous with counterintelligence. He had served in Korea, Vietnam, and as a liaison to NATO, earning medals for his work in intercepting Soviet communications. His wife, Eleanor, had once said he'd rather die than let a single secret slip. But the briefcase told a different story. Inside were documents detailing U.S. nuclear targeting strategies for Eastern Europe, a list of NATO operatives under KGB surveillance, and a coded message addressed to Comrade Ivanov. The KGB had approached him in 1966 during a leave of absence in East Berlin. A man claiming to be a Soviet engineer, Alexander Petrov, had invited Wexler to a technical demonstration at a factory near the Spree River. Petrov spoke of shared interests in dismantling U.S. military dominance. Wexler, a man of rigid principles, had dismissed him, but Petrov returned months later, this time with a photograph of Wexler's younger brother Daniel, who had died in a car accident in 1964. The photo was doctored, showing Daniel alive, his face altered. Wexler's recruitment was methodical. Petrov had studied his habits, his love for jazz, his visits to a cafe near the Berlin Wall, his habit of leaving his briefcase unlocked during lunch breaks. In December 1967, a woman named Irina Volkov, posing as a translator, began working at a U.S. embassy event. She passed him a cigarette labeled with a red star. When he lit it, the filter released a faint chemical scent. Later that night, he found a small vial of liquid in his coat pocket, along with a note, "You are not alone." The KGB's tradecraft was precise. They used a dead drop near the Berlin television tower. where Wexler would leave encrypted memos in hollowed-out books from a local library. The code was a variation of the Visionaire cipher, with keys hidden in the titles of his favorite novels. For months, Wexler balanced his double life, attending NATO meetings by day, meeting Petrov in shadowy alleys by night. He began carrying a second set of keys, a false passport, and a hidden compartment in his watch. But the psychological toll was relentless. Wexler's wife noticed his sleeplessness, his sudden aversion to alcohol. His daughter Sarah, a teenager at the time, asked, "Why do you always look like you're waiting for someone to catch you?" He had no answer. The KGB had promised him protection, a new identity, and a chance to reshape the world, but the guilt gnawed at him. Every time he handed over a classified report, he imagined the faces of his colleagues, the men who had trusted him with their lives. The KGB's operation had a code name, Operation Echo. It was part of a broader campaign to infiltrate U.S. military intelligence, a campaign that would later be exposed in the 1970s. But in 1968, Wexler was a ghost in the machine, his betrayal, a quiet storm, and the briefcase left at the dead drop was the first crack in the dam. The dead drop in Berlin had been his first mistake. A single sheet of microfilm, folded into a hollowed-out cigarette case, left in a park bench at 3,000 a.m. The KGB had taught him to be methodical, to leave no trace. But the cigarette case was flawed. A hairline crack in the glass, a smudge of fingerprint residue. It was enough. The Americans found it. They found him. For years, he had walked the tightrope between two worlds. In the U.S. Army, he was Colonel Thomas Granger, a decorated officer with a Medal for Valor in Vietnam and a reputation for unshakable loyalty. In the shadows, he was Blackbird, a code name whispered in KGB safe houses, a man who passed secrets to Moscow in the dead of night. His double life was a mosaic of lies, a forged passport tucked in his sock drawer, a hollowed-out Bible used to conceal encrypted messages, a safe house in East Berlin where he met with handlers under the guise of a civilian contractor. The KGB had recruited him in 1968 during a routine transfer to West Germany. A Soviet officer, posing as a journalist, had slipped him a note in a coffee shop. "The world is not as it seems." It read, "You are not alone." The message was a cipher, a key to a larger game. Granger had hesitated for weeks, but the promise of $5,000 a month, enough to pay off his wife's medical bills, sealed his fate. The psychological toll was immediate. He began sleepwalking, his mind fractured by the weight of his choices. At work, he avoided eye contact, his colleagues noting his sudden aloofness. His wife, Margaret, begged him to talk, but he refused. "I can't," he told her once, his voice shaking. "Not yet." She didn't know he was passing nuclear codes to the Soviets, or that he had betrayed a unit of 12 soldiers during a mission in 1971. The loneliness was suffocating. He had no confidants, no one to share the burden. His son, James, had stopped speaking to him after a brutal argument in 1973. "You're not my father," the boy had said, tears streaking his face. "You're a traitor." Granger had no answer. He had become a ghost in his own life. A man who lived in two places at once but belonged to neither. The KGB had warned him, trust is a currency. Once spent, it cannot be reclaimed. He had believed them. But the real betrayal was not the one he committed. It was the one he endured. Every night he stared at the ceiling, wondering if his wife still loved him, if his son would ever forgive him, if the man in the mirror was still the soldier who had sworn to protect his country. The dead drop in Berlin had been his first mistake. The second would be his last. The trial was a spectacle of cold calculation. His name, Colonel Gregory Hartman, had been etched into the annals of military service since 1952, awards for valor, commendations for leadership, and a reputation as a man who would die before betraying his oath. But the courtroom saw a different man, a hollow-eyed figure in a starched uniform, his once pristine medals now a mockery of duty. The KGB's dossier, unearthed from a Moscow safe house, detailed every dead drop he'd facilitated, every coded message he'd passed to Soviet handlers. The evidence was damning. 17 intercepted communications, 4 confirmed deaths of CIA operatives in Eastern Europe, and a network of safe houses stretching from Prague to Budapest. "You sold secrets that cost lives," the prosecutor intoned, his voice echoing through the marble hall. "You turned your back on every soldier who trusted you." Hartman's silence was the only response. The sentence was swift: 20 years in Leavenworth. A punishment that felt like a lifetime for a man who had once led men into battle. His wife, Margaret, filed for divorce within weeks. Their children, now teenagers, were left to navigate the stigma of a father who had become a ghost in their lives. Letters from his former comrades were never delivered, burned in the barracks, deemed too toxic to read. He was the kind of man who would carry a rifle into a firefight, but never a weapon against his own country, said Captain Elaine Voss, his former platoon leader. "We trusted him with our lives. Now we wonder if we ever knew him at all." The fallout was measured in shattered careers and blood-stained missions. The CIA's Operation Nightshade, a covert effort to monitor Soviet troop movements in 1969, collapsed entirely. 3 agents were killed in a botched extraction near the Hungarian border, their deaths attributed to leaks Hartman had enabled. The KGB in their declassified archives called him a valuable asset who never hesitated to cross the line. "He believed in the Soviet cause," said a former KGB officer, his voice thick with irony. "He saw the USSR as a beacon of progress. To him, the United States was the enemy. But the true cost was not in numbers or operations, it was in the silence that followed." Hartman's colleagues never spoke of him again. His children grew up with a father they could not honor, a name they refused to say aloud. And in the shadow world of espionage, his story became a warning that the deepest betrayals are not always born of greed, but of a twisted belief that the enemy's cause is just. The soldier in every war somehow betrayed by their own. The question remains: how many more will follow?